At times, I am struck with how small things, tiny things, can obstruct our view of big things. I was thinking of the example of the size of the sun in our solar system. I don't know if you probably took this in high school, or you can Google it later if you want, but the sun is really, really big, right? It's huge. It's so big, you can wrap your mind around this, that you can fit 1 million Earths in the sun. And the Earth is big, right? And you can fit 1 million of them in the sun. The moon, on the other hand, our moon, the moon that orbits the planet Earth, is relatively small, although it's still pretty big. It's about a quarter of the size of the Earth. That means then you could fit, roughly, this is not a precise calculation, so if I'm off a little bit here, don't correct me later. It's just a rough guess. About 4 million moons in the sun. So in comparison to the sun, the moon is really, really tiny, right? And yet, if the moon lines up just perfectly between the Earth and the sun, it blocks out the sun, right? You call that a lunar eclipse. Is that right? Somebody who knows astronomy, say I'm right about that. Lunar eclipse? Okay, good. Thank you. A tiny thing, the moon, can block out a huge thing, the sun. I think that is how it is with God sometimes. I think we let our lives on this earth, the things of this earth, which are really, really, really tiny in the vastness of the universe, obstruct our view of the Lord, who is much greater than the entirety of the universe. And what needs to happen in those times when our tininess, the things of this world, obstruct our view of the greatness of God, what needs to happen in order to unblock our view is we need to realize our smallness and recognize that we are at His mercy. I want to be very careful here to not confuse what I mean by smallness with what many in the secular world or the godless world would believe about our being small. With our advances in science, we've been able to gaze into the universe a little bit. And what is abundantly clear is that as we look out into the solar system and into the galaxy and into the universe beyond, the universe is incredibly huge. Scientists believe that they can measure the measurable distance that we can measure of the universe, that the radius of the universe is 46 billion light years. That's the radius. That would mean then, of what we think we can measure, it would take 92 billion years traveling at the speed of light to go across the universe. That's a long road trip. And if you have children, you'll be familiar with the phrase, "Are we there yet?" How many times? 92 billion years of travel. How many times do you think you'd hear, "Are we there yet?" And that's only what we think we can measure. It's absolutely huge. Any reasonable person looks at that and concludes that in the vastness of the universe and how absolutely massive it is, that we as human beings are really, really, really tiny. A speck of sand doesn't do justice to how small we are in the vastness of the universe. And that's true. We are really, really, really tiny in the vastness of the universe. But godless thinking leads many to conclude that our tininess is the equivalent of being insignificant. In other words, because we are so small, we don't matter. It doesn't matter how we live. It doesn't matter what we do. It's all nothingness because we're just a speck in the vast scheme of things. See, they equate being tiny with being insignificant. And that is to miss the point of why the universe is so big. It is true that the universe is huge and that in comparison to the universe, we are tiny. But don't mistake that with our being insignificant. God made the universe so big to display His glory. Because God is awesome. You want to know why the universe is so big? Because God is awesome. That's why it's so big. And He made us so tiny that we might know our need of Him. That's why things are so big and we are so tiny. So yes, we are tiny, and yes, we are weak, but we are not, as human beings, insignificant. Those two things are different. If you doubt that, you only need to look to God's gift of His only Son. That should be enough for us to realize that we are not insignificant. God killed His Son for you, you speck of sand in the vastness of the universe. Yes, you're tiny, but you're not insignificant. Much like the moon blocking out the light of the sun, we can sometimes, even though we are as tiny as we are, we can obstruct our own view of God's glory, our ability to see Him, because we get consumed by the tininess of our life. In God's grace, however, God reminds us oftentimes of our smallness. And again, not our insignificance, but our smallness. And that's important to keep that distinction in your mind as we work through our text this morning. In chapter 27 of the book of Acts, Luke gives us the account of Paul setting out for Rome. One of the things that strikes me about this account of Paul's journey to Rome is the incredible detail which Luke gives us, which flies in the face of historical revisionists who would try and tell you that the original authors of Scripture were not trying to write history. They were just trying to tell nice stories, nice moral stories with a point. If that's true, if you're just telling a story for the sake of telling story, you don't offer this amount of detail. The reason why Luke is offering all this detail is for a reason, so we would know that it happened. You can follow the map of the Middle East and the Mediterranean and Asia Minor, and you can see all the places where they stopped. These are literal places. These are literal things that happen. This is such a detailed account. One historian has said, this is the most detailed account of maritime travel, that is, travel by sea in the ancient world, in the Bible. That's pretty cool, I think. It's also important for us to notice the return of the personal pronoun in these verses, the personal pronoun we. That means that as Luke travels, he's not only writing in a historical manner, he is also claiming to be an eyewitness to these events. Luke was with Paul when these things occurred. Now, obviously, because of time, we don't have the time this morning to work through all of these verses in all of chapter 27, but I want to give you the big picture as we work through these things this morning. I see 5 things that we have here that are of significance in chapter 27. 5 things quickly. The wisdom of Paul. I do apologize, there is no PowerPoint this morning, so you'll have to, if you're taking notes, you'll have to listen carefully. First, the wisdom of Paul. Secondly, we see the weakness of human beings. Thirdly, we see the grace of God. Fourth, we see a display of great faith. And fifth, we see God's deliverance. So Paul's wisdom, the weakness of human beings, the grace of God, a display of faith, and God's deliverance. Those are the 5 big things I think we see in chapter 27. First, we see the wisdom of Paul. Paul's trip to Rome is to happen by sea, which was the common way to travel from the Mideast, Palestine, all the way to Italy, where Rome was. It was easier to travel by sea for the most part because terrain across land would have been difficult. So that's a common way to travel in the Roman Empire. From the coast of Palestine to the shores of Italy meant a massive trip across the Mediterranean. It's a little bit different today in cruise ships that you can rent, but the ships that they traveled in were not the cruise ships of today. And this would have been a massive, major undertaking to go from Palestine to Rome by sea. Luke tells us that they tried to stay fairly close to shore, close to the coast as they journeyed. They would do this for 2 reasons. One, for safety. Dangerous to go out in the middle of the Mediterranean. You don't know what the weather conditions are going to be, as we see in as we see what takes place here in chapter 27. And secondly, as you travel along the coast, that gives you opportunity to stop in at cities, to trade goods, to take goods off of the ship and to bring goods onto the ship, to take people off the ship and to bring people onto the ship. It gives you an opportunity to replenish your supply. So that's why they stay close to shore and they stop in at cities. There were no fridges in the ancient world. So if you wanted supplies, you needed to stop off on a regular basis. We also learn from verse 3 that the centurion in charge of Paul's imprisonment, of Paul's transport to Rome, is kind to Paul. Look at verse 3 with me of chapter 27. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, who's the centurion in charge, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. Remember that at this point, by this point, Paul's been in prison, he's been in jail for 2 years. Now, think about that. How many people like hospital food? Anybody stay in the hospital? Anybody like hospital food? One person likes hospital food. Excellent. You'll do okay when you get older, Jim, because you'll probably spend more time. Well, anyway. Prison food, especially in the ancient world, was terrible. Now, after you've been in prison for 2 years, how nice would it have been to finally be able to freely fellowship with fellow believers, to go over to some folks' homes that you knew? Remember, Paul's been all around this area preaching and evangelizing. He knows people all over the empire. And when they stop in the city, of course he knows people. And Julius shows him kindness and allows him to go. How nice would it have been to see those people after being locked up for 2 years? And I have to say, how nice would it have been to eat some real food? You know, and get those necessities in life, those little creature comforts that we sometimes take for granted that have been absent from his life for 2 years. And he gets an opportunity because of the kindness of this centurion. We're not told the reason, but the centurion trusted Paul to return to the ship. Right? You don't let prisoners go. That's a bad plan if you're a law enforcement officer. You got a criminal in the back of the car, you stop off at the corner. Hey, do you mind if I just run into the convenience store and get a bag of chips before we head on down to the station? No police officer in their right mind is going to do that. Why? Because they'll run. And yet, this centurion thinks Paul will return to the ship. I'll let you go ashore, meet friends, get your needs met, and then you're going to come back. I think that tells us a lot about Paul's character. That this man, whose life would have been on the line, right? Well, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but he trusts Paul so much, a prisoner, that he would let him go ashore, believing that he'll return to the ship. Paul's reputation is one of honesty and integrity. He's trusted even by his jailer. I think that tells us something of the kind of Christian character that we ought to aspire to. Would our jailer trust us to return? Are we that honest? Are we that people of that much integrity? Paul was. We also learned that at the beginning of the trip, the travelers did not experience favorable conditions. As they were trying to sail across the Mediterranean, they encountered a headwind. Now, I don't know a lot about sailing, but I know this. If the wind is blowing against you where you want to go, that makes things harder. And you go slower. Look at verse 9. Much time had been lost because of the slowness of the journey, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them. We'll read verse 10 too. Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. God in His providence has established in the world seasons of weather. The fast that Luke is talking about here is likely the Day of Atonement. That is a day every year celebrated in the Jewish calendar. And in this year, which we can date to about 59 AD, the Day of Atonement took place in October. So when they are sailing, Luke is careful to point out that this is the time of year where it's beginning to be dangerous to sail. And so Paul says in verse 10, don't go anywhere. We're in a harbor. They're in a harbor. It's not an ideal harbor, but they're in somewhat of a harbor. And Paul says, look, don't leave here, or we'll be lost. The ship will be lost. The cargo will be lost. And our own lives also will be lost. I think it's important to remember that Paul has been sailing the Mediterranean for many years, probably 15 years. On his missionary journeys, Paul has been sailing around the Mediterranean. You can go and work your way back through the book of Acts and find all the places where Paul boarded a ship and he traveled from one place to another. He's been sailing a lot. In fact, it is not unreasonable to suggest that Paul, the prisoner, is the most experienced sailor on the ship. And he knows the time to sail and he knows the time to stay. Don't go, or everything and everyone will be lost. There's some debate among commentators whether this is a word from God, whether this is something God is supernaturally telling Paul, or whether Paul is just saying this on his own. My own conviction is that this is not a supernatural word from the Lord. Because, the reason I think that is because Luke usually makes that abundantly clear. When God directly speaks to Paul, he usually tells us about it. And so I think this is just a case of an experienced man who sailed for many, many years. And he knows the rule. You don't sail in winter. You're asking for it. God has, in His providence, established regular weather patterns in our world. And we ought to be thankful that He does that. That's a good thing. Can you imagine if winter was unpredictable? What if winter came in July one year and in December the next year? And you could never predict, you'd never have any idea when winter would show up. That would make it incredibly difficult to farm, wouldn't it? You'd never know when to plant your crops. You'd never know if they're going to be destroyed. You'd never know, you wouldn't be able to function. God in His mercy has established generally common, consistent weather patterns, and we ought to be thankful for this. And Paul has recognized this. You don't sail in winter. That's what Paul warns them. You don't have to study the life of Paul to know, you don't have to study his life very long to know that he trusts God in everything. There is no way Paul would have done half of what he did, even a quarter of what he did, if he didn't absolutely trust God in everything. But he also clearly believes that God gives people intellects, brains, the ability to reason, to recognize things on purpose. And that is what Paul is doing here. He's using his intellect. He's recognizing his smallness here in comparison to the weather. And he realizes that he and his companions are at the mercy of the weather. Wisdom recognizes the need to live according to God's established patterns. And that's what Paul does here. Don't sail during the winter. So we see Paul's wisdom, number one. Secondly, we see the weakness of people. You know, it's funny what happens here. Most of the people don't listen to Paul. Most of the people on the boat don't listen to them, and they think it's better. This harbor is not the best place to stay for winter. And we're going to travel on. And one day, as they're thinking about moving on to a safer harbor, greener pastures, a gentle south wind, it says, comes up. And they think, this is it. This is the opportunity for us to sail to a better place. Because we have the right conditions in this moment to set sail. But they quickly find out that Paul was right. The sea conditions change very rapidly, as happens in the winter months, which is why you don't sail in the winter. The conditions changed very rapidly before they could do anything. They were at the mercy of a very powerful storm. Luke says in verse 14 that it was a wind of hurricane force. That means a really, really powerful wind, really strong. Verse 15 tells us that the boat was being driven along by the wind. They tried to fight it, they tried to go against it, but eventually they realized that their tiny vessel against this awesome wind could never make any headway, and it says they give way to the wind, and they just are carried along by the wind, and they're not in control of their boat. They're going wherever the wind blows them. How's that for an illustration for life? You ever feel like that in your life? That you've been struggling and you've been fighting, and finally you feel like you've got absolutely no control of anything that's happening in your life. You're totally at the mercy of all the circumstances that have arisen. That's the picture that this boat brings to mind. They did what they could. They tied ropes around the ship. Whether or not they would have to swim under the boat to wrap the rope around the ship, or whether they could just let it down and tie it around, I don't know. But somehow they got ropes tied around the vessel, which would offer it strength from cracking apart. They let down some what's called a sea anchor to try and slow their being pushed by the wind. And they lightened the ship. They got rid of some cargo to make it lighter in the water. They did what they could, but ultimately they're at the mercy of the storm. They have no real control over their ship because they have no control over the wind. Psalm 135 verse 7, jot that down. Psalm 135 verse 7. He makes clouds, speaking of God, He makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with the rain and brings out the wind from His storehouses. So who is it that has control over the wind? God has control over the wind. These men have none. Sometimes we get to thinking in our lives, as they did, that we're pretty powerful. We can figure things out and we can get things done, right? Don't listen to Paul. Don't listen to Paul. We can find a better place. We've got the gentle wind from the south. We can press on. We think we're in control. We understand the circumstances. I mean, think of the things in our life, in our world, that we can do. Human beings have gone to the moon. That's amazing. We can do amazing things. And sometimes, with all that we can do, we think ourselves pretty powerful. And when we think ourselves in control, when we think we've got a handle on this thing or that thing and we can figure it all out on our own, we end up ignoring God. But God uses simple things like the wind and storms to show us how utterly weak we are. You know, for all we can do, being able to go to the moon, we still can't control the wind. No human being can do anything to stop the wind, but Jesus merely says the word, and the winds are calm. Helplessness, coming to the place where we recognize how many things are out of our control and that we're utterly helpless, can give people perspective. And that's the situation that these men on this boat find themselves in. Helplessness can help give people perspective. Thirdly, we see the greatness of God's grace. This storm turns out to be really bad and lasts for a long period of time. Look at verse 20. Imagine this. I don't know how many of you have been out in open water, but try and imagine being on this boat in this situation. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued to rage, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So this was happening, in fact, we find out later, 14 days in this storm. 2 weeks in a storm. You don't see the sun because of the overcastness of the sky. You don't see the stars. All you see is wind and waves and storm for 14 days. Things are bad, right? Like, imagine yourself being in the hold of that ship. Things are bad. And they are absolutely convinced, verse 20, we gave up how much hope? All hope of being saved. We're done. We're going to die in this boat in the middle of the sea. The ship is going to sink, and no one's going to find us. They didn't send out search parties in those days. There were no homing beacons. There was no distress calls. Your ship sank. You didn't show up after 4 or 5 weeks, and they just said, well, they're lost somewhere in the sea, and that's it. And they're totally convinced. They're totally convinced that they're going to die. Verse 21 says they had gone a long time without food. Now, this is either because of seasickness, not eating. That's why I wouldn't be eating. I'd get terribly seasick. Or fear. They're anxious. And so when you're anxious, you often don't feel like eating. Now, how tiny, right? You go out to the top of the boat and you look around. All you see, as far as you can see, is water. All you can see is wind, waves, storm. That's it. On this little tiny boat in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. How tiny do you think they felt in that moment? I bet you they felt really, really tiny and insignificant. At the end of verse 21, Paul begins to speak to them. Look at the second half of verse 21. Paul stood up before them and said, I love this, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage. Keep up my courage, Paul? Have you looked outside? Keep up your courage. Because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. The first thing I see, or we might see, when Paul begins to speak to these guys, is a big I told you so. You like those moments when you realize you're wrong and somebody says, I told you not to do that, and you did it anyway. That might be possible. I don't dispute that. Paul may be saying, I told you so in this. But I think it's more likely that Paul is saying, look, you didn't listen to me the first time, right? Look where it's gotten you. Listen to me this time. Right? I was right before, I'm right now. Listen up, pay attention to what I'm saying to you. The message that Paul wants them to listen to is a message of God's grace. Verse 24, when the angel speaks to Paul and tells him that you must stand trial, brings us all the way back to chapter 23, verse 11, where Jesus comes and stands with Paul as he's in jail, and he says, Paul, don't be afraid, because you're going to Rome, and as you've testified before these men about me, you're going to testify about me in Rome. Jesus has ordained that Paul will go to Rome. I really think that verse 23, chapter 23, verse 11, governs the whole last portion of the book of Acts. Luke is trying to show us in this last part of the book of Acts that Jesus, King Jesus, is bringing His purposes into being. Will the desire of James to gloss over the theological differences between Paul and the Pharisees prevent Jesus' purposes from coming into being? No. In fact, He uses them to bring His purposes into being. Will a corrupt lawyer and jealous religious leaders cease Jesus' purposes coming into being? No. They won't. Will a governor who's trying to play both sides of the fence and make the Jews happy and also obey Roman law, will he prevent Jesus' purposes from coming into being? Absolutely not. Will a storm of hurricane force blowing across the Mediterranean prevent Jesus' purposes from coming into being? No, they won't. Jesus is in control of this situation, and He has ordained that Paul go to Rome. Now here's where we see the greatness of God's grace. God is under no obligation to save these guys in the middle of the sea. He's under no obligation to save the 275 others. He's only bound himself to save Paul because he's ordained that Paul would go to Rome. He doesn't have to see. He could just save Paul and let everybody else die because of their arrogance in not listening to Paul, of not understanding the patterns that he has ordained, that God has ordained, not Paul. They shouldn't have sailed, but they did. God is under no obligation to save any of these guys. But He does. He says to Paul that all of these guys will be saved. True, the ship will be lost, and all the cargo will be lost. But God promises to spare the lives of every person on the ship. Amazing. You see, what being at the mercy of the storm, being at the mercy of life should make us realize is that we are much more so at the mercy of God, not the storm. Because the storm is controlled or governed ultimately by God. See, if we recognize that, if we recognize our own smallness, it allows us to see the greatness of God's grace. It's as if it's not only the ropes that are wrapped around the boat in the middle of this hopeless situation, this terrible storm, but it's as if the mighty hand of God is under the waters, holding on to the boat to ensure that these men will not be lost. It is God's grace that is on display to undeserving men, because they would not live by His ordained patterns for life. Fourth, there is a great display. So we see God's grace. And fourthly, we see a great display of faith on the part of Paul, which brings the others on the ship along with him. You see, Paul does not tell them that everything's going to be okay, that they're going to live, that they're going to survive when the sky is clear and the breezes are gentle. He makes this declaration before the storm is over. In the midst of the hurricane, Paul makes this promise. He declares that they will be spared when the storm is still raging, and everyone believes the situation is without hope. They all thought to a man that they were going to die, and Paul says, listen, God's going to spare you. It is a bold claim to say that God has spoken. When you say that kind of thing, you're attaching God's reputation to whatever it is that you say. Now, how many of you know, show of hands, how many of you know that God is not a big fan of saying that He said something when He didn't say it? Only 3 people know that's true. That's not good. Okay? God is not, when you say God has said something that He really hasn't said, God is not a fan of that. It's a bold claim to claim that God has spoken. God has spoken to Paul here, and Paul acts according to faith. 2 actions lead me to think that most of the others believed what Paul had said. First, there's a situation where a few of them, they sense they're getting closer to land, and a few of them try to make an escape for it in a lifeboat, thinking that, again, they're taking their life into their own hands without recognizing the mercy of God. And Paul says, don't let those guys leave the ship. If those guys leave the ship, everyone else is going to be lost. And the men on the boat respond by cutting the ropes, getting rid of the lifeboat. There's no plan B here, right? The lifeboat's gone. The only option they have is to stay on board and put themselves at the mercy of God that Paul has declared to them. They cut the ropes and abandon the lifeboat. Secondly, the second thing they do, I think, that leads me to think that they believed Paul, is they have a meal. They've been in this storm for 14 days, and they've eaten little or nothing during that time. either because of sickness, because of the difficulty to prepare food, because the water running over the boat has ruined many of the provisions. We're not sure, he doesn't say, but for whatever reason they haven't eaten a whole lot. And in the middle of the storm, Paul says, you need to eat something. And at their urging, after Paul gives thanks to God for some bread, and he gives it to others, and they eat as much as they want, they then cast everything else overboard. Paul knew that they would need strength. Once the ship was run aground, they would need strength to survive, so he tells them, you need to eat. Now, if you're convinced you're going to die, and you're not feeling like eating because you're either seasick or anxious about the situation, and you're convinced that you're going to die, you won't eat. What's the point? These men must have been convinced that they were going to live because they eat something. They believe what God has said through Paul. So it would seem that Paul's example of faith encouraged them to believe God's promise that their lives would be spared. You know, that's a good definition of faith. You want to know, faith is simply believing that what God said, He will accomplish. If God promised it, He will bring it into being. That's what faith in Christ ultimately boils down to, that you believe that what God has promised, He will do, regardless of how the circumstances look. And you act according to those promises. Believing in the greatness of God's grace produces hope. These guys go from a hopeless situation, they all thought they were going to die, to suddenly taking in a meal because they believed what Paul had said, what God had said through Paul. Finally, we see the deliverance of all those on board. So now God's committed to saving all of them. Luke tells us that there are 276 people on board. When daylight comes, they see a place of safety to run the ship aground, but it gets stuck on a sandbar before it gets to shore. And the soldiers think, we should kill the prisoners, because if we don't, they'll swim away and they will escape. You see, Roman law was that if you were in charge of a prisoner and you let that prisoner escape, you would inherit the punishment of the prisoner. And if that was the death penalty, you would die. So what should we do? We should kill them all so they don't escape. But that would have overturned God's promise, right? God promised that Paul said all of them would be saved. Not even lose a single hair on their head. They would be totally unharmed. And so God turns the heart of the centurion to stop the men from killing anyone. Some of them swim to shore, others have to float to shore. Those who can't swim float to shore on wood taken from the ship. And every single person, all 276 people, make it to shore alive. Just as Paul said. The ship was destroyed, everything was lost, but no one died. And the point for us is what God promises. When God promises something, He delivers. Maybe you're here this morning and you need a little perspective on your life. Perhaps that you've let the things in your life block out your view of God's glory. Block out your view of who God is, what He's promised, and what He has said. And you just can't see it because of all those things that are in the way. And you need a little perspective in your life. And I hope that this morning, if you look at the example of Paul and you examine your own life, that you recognize how tiny you are. That the circumstances in your life make you realize how small these things in your life really are. They're tiny in the vastness of eternity. And that will allow you, once you see the tininess of all those things, it allows you to look past them to see God. Yes, you are tiny. Yes, I am tiny and small, but not insignificant. God loves you, and He gave His Son for you. Will you trust Him with your life today? Will you know the power of His strength in the middle of the storm? Will you believe and be delivered? I hope so. Let's pray. God, your greatness abounds. Your mercy is great. Father, as you have the reins of the storm. You control all things. Help us to recognize that and help us to trust in you and your goodness. May we turn to you and have hope of a secure future. Lord, it is not unreasonable to trust and believe that you will raise us from the dead, for you have raised your Son from the dead and have promised that all those who call on his name will also be raised. So God, our faith is not foolishness, but it is reasonable and it is sure. And I pray that you would make it solid in the hearts of many here today. I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.